We have a great lineup tonight. The focus of tonight, just to confirm for everybody, it's an update on the PennEast pipeline project, but focusing specifically on all the elements that are most relevant to the Pennsylvania side of the project. So we won't be talking about New Jersey permitting. We'll be talking about Pennsylvania permitting this evening, along with the status of things at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the Delaware River Basin Commission. So if you want to hear about New Jersey, that's tomorrow night. We're going to get the review of the status of things on the Pennsylvania portion, or under the Pennsylvania permitting, from Aaron Stemplewicz. He's the staff attorney with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And then I, Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware Riverkeeper, am going to do a little update on the Delaware River Basin Commission and what's happening there. And then we're going to have Karen Feridun from Berks Gas Truth talk a little bit about what's happening at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and some upcoming events on that front that are particularly relevant to PennEast, along with other pipeline projects across the nation. After we have those presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. But again, we're going to keep things on mute because it just becomes too difficult to open up the phone lines for people to verbally ask their own questions. But what we will be doing instead is asking people, as the presentations are going on, as questions come to your mind, type them up in the chat box. We will capture them and we'll ask and answer all of the questions at the end of the webinar, and I, as moderator, will simply present them to the speakers. Doing it this way also allows you to sort of capture your questions in writing as they come to you, and you don't have to wait till the end and potentially forget them. So we find that this approach works well for the webinar, but it also works well for webinar participants, making sure that all their questions get asked and answered. With that, I am going to invite Aaron Stemplewicz to begin his presentation on what is happening in the state of Pennsylvania with regards to reviews and approvals of the PennEast pipeline project.
Great. Thank you, Maya. Again, my name is Aaron Stemplewicz. I'm Senior Attorney at the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. And I'm just going to provide a really quick 5 to 10 minute overview on the permitting / approval update for PennEast in Pennsylvania. So I'll just give a quick preview of what we're talking about here. There's essentially 5 different permits / approvals / certifications that PennEast needs to obtain in the context of Pennsylvania in order for the project to move forward. They're listed here before you. The first one you can see is the Section 401 Water Quality Certification. 2 is the Chapter 102 Erosion and Sediment Control Permit. The third one is the Chapter 105 Obstruction and Encroachment Permit. 4 is the NPDES PAG 10 permit. Essentially, that is a hydrostatic water discharging permit. And the last one is a Title V air permit. I'm going to give you an update on which one of these have been issued, which ones haven't, which ones have been noticed, which ones have not been noticed, which ones have had applications submitted, and which ones haven't, and I can even provide some guesses on some timelines. So moving to the first one, we have the Section 401 Water Quality Certification. As you can see, the application was submitted in February of 2016. It was noticed in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on May 14th of 2016. The comments were accepted until mid-June. It was considered complete in late June, and it was eventually approved on February 7th, 2017, and noticed in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on February 25th, 2017. That particular water quality certification has been challenged by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. The briefing on that certification has been completed, and oral argument is actually scheduled to take place on October 12th, 2017 in Pittsburgh. And the specific docket number for that federal lawsuit is docket number 17-1456. The oral argument is open to the public, so you're welcome to take a trip to Pittsburgh if you'd like to visit Pittsburgh and take in an oral argument. You're more than welcome to do so. I'll be there. The attorney likely going to be arguing the case, his name is Mark Freed from Kern and Hefner. And there are a variety of issues on the table with regard to the water quality certification, ranging from issues of notice to issues of implicating potentially the Pennsylvania Environmental Rights Amendment, all sorts of fun arguments that the court is going to have to sort out. So, like I said, that's coming up in October, and it could be resolved before the end of the year. I imagine the court will make a decision before the end of the year. The next permit I'm going to talk about, well, going back, let's just say the water quality certification requires PennEast to get 3 additional state permits. And we're going to talk about these 3 additional state permits next. The first one is the Chapter 102 Erosion and Sediment Control Permit. This is permit number ESG02000160001. And that was submitted to the department in 2016. There has been at least one deficiency letter that I'm aware of, and no notice has been provided in the Pennsylvania Bulletin for completeness or for comments. And I don't know what timeline there is for it being considered complete based on that incomplete letter that PennEast got a year ago. But it is my understanding right now that no notice has been provided in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and this permit has not been issued. To the extent it does get issued, it would be subject to a potential challenge to perhaps the Third Circuit if it gets that far. But it'll be good to keep an eye out for that specific permit number. Unfortunately, if you go on the PADEP's website, they have an e-fax portion of their website where you can track permits. It's my understanding that as of right now, you can't track erosion and sediment control permits, which is unfortunate. So you don't have an idea of where they are along in the process. So the best thing we can do is scour the Pennsylvania Bulletin or do file reviews or right-to-know requests to get an idea of where we are along in that process. The next permit is the Chapter 105 Water Obstruction Encroachment permits. Again, these are part of the water quality certification. I have listed on the screen here the permit numbers. If you punch these into the PADEP eFax website, they will come up, and you can see what their status is. All of these were submitted on March 11th, except for the Bucks County one, which was submitted on February 8th. Again, none of these have been considered complete. There's been no notice provided in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and they have not been issued. So there's still time if anybody's interested in doing file reviews and submitting comments. There's plenty of time to do so for the water obstruction and encroachment permits. And again, these would be subject to potential appeals at the Third Circuit, potentially at the Third Circuit. And so the water obstruction and encroachment permits, they're essentially permits for any activities that encroach upon waterways and wetlands, which this pipeline will certainly do. The NPDES PAG-10 permit is a hydrostatic testing discharge permit. Essentially, when PennEast wants to test, or any pipeline company wants to test the integrity of the pipeline, they run water through it and make sure that there are no leaks. That's one of the ways that they test to make sure that all the welds are done properly. But that water has to come from somewhere and go somewhere. And so that's essentially what this permit does. It's my understanding that this permit hasn't even been applied for yet as of March 2017. It's a permit application could have come in since then, but on the PADEP website, the latest information is from March, and that's all we have to go off of as of right now. But it certainly hasn't been noticed, and it certainly has been issued. For these NPDES permits, the department doesn't even have any notice requirements. So we won't even necessarily be able to look in the Pennsylvania Bulletin and learn whether or not this permit has been issued. Despite the fact that there are no regulations on the book, it is possible that PADEP might, because of the high-profile nature of the PennEast pipeline, they might put public notice in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, but there's no regs requiring them to do so. So this one we have to watch out very carefully for on our own, because we won't be able to submit comments, or the public won't be able to submit comments on it and get engaged with regard to this permit until after it's issued, unless they're very careful. The last one I'll talk about briefly, because it's a little bit out of our wheelhouse, is the Title V Clean Air Act permit. Again, I have the permit listed up here. It's number 13-00019A. It was noticed in May of 2016, and comments were accepted until March in 2017. So the comment period is technically closed, but it has not been issued. And to the extent you're interested in air issues, I would suggest taking a look at it, and you can submit comments. And there's a lot of good case law out there suggesting that to the extent that the department has had sufficient time to review the permits before making it, sufficient time to review comments prior to making their decision on whether to issue the permit or not, it must be considered as part of the record. So that should be an incentive for people who are interested in air issues, really, to get involved and get involved quickly. So that's the major Pennsylvania permits that are left. And if anybody has questions, they can feel free to type into the box, and we can try to answer them later. That's pretty much it for me.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. Hi, this is Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware Riverkeeper. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another very important regulatory agency when it comes to the PennEast pipeline project. PennEast is unfortunately one of many pipeline projects that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network is right now actively challenging through our advocacy as well as in the courts. One thing that we have for these pipeline projects that are passing through boundaries of the Delaware River watershed that other pipeline battles don't have is an agency called the Delaware River Basin Commission. While I think you all know, at this point, both the states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, through which PennEast cuts, have the ability to say no to the PennEast pipeline project, largely through authorities that are given to them through the Clean Water Act, through the Clean Air Act, authority that is preserved by the Federal Natural Gas Act, which preempts all other state laws and local laws that would otherwise apply. But another agency, entity, regulatory decision-making body that we have that has the capacity to say no is the Delaware River Basin Commission. And that's because while the Natural Gas Act preempts the authority of the states unless it comes through a federal law like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, the Natural Gas Act does not preempt the Delaware River Basin Commission because it is essentially on par with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission by virtue of the fact that it was created partially by a federal law. So the 4 watershed states and the federal government all passed legislation that created and gave authority to the Delaware River Basin Commission when it comes to the water resources of the Delaware River watershed. And amongst the authorities that the DRBC has by virtue of all of this is authority over certain pipeline projects like the PennEast project that passes through the boundaries of the watershed. Now, the PennEast Pipeline Company filed its application with the DRBC January 29, 2016. And in its application, it specifically said it was seeking authorization from the Delaware River Basin Commission for surface water withdrawals, to conduct hydrostatic testing, to conduct horizontal directional drilling, and to do some other ancillary functions like use water for dust control. That's what they limited their application to the DRBC to, those activities. But the Delaware River Basin Commission does actually have broader authority when it comes to pipelines like the PennEast pipeline project. And I think that PennEast specifically limited its application because it's trying to deny this broader authority that the DRBC actually has. The DRBC's jurisdiction over the PennEast pipeline project actually includes the full length and breadth of the pipeline project to the extent that it has impacts on the water resources of the Delaware River Basin. When you look at the language of the DRBC regulations, they talk about DRBC having authority over pipelines where there is a significant disturbance of ground cover affecting the water resources of the basin. There's a lot of that when it comes to the PennEast pipeline project. So DRBC's authority is certainly far broader than what the PennEast pipeline company is seeking to assert. That gives us all a wealth of opportunity to really challenge the PennEast pipeline project before the Delaware River Basin Commission and to encourage them to say no. Now, while we have an application to the DRBC, we have not really seen much activity out of the DRBC to give us guidance on what they're doing and or when they intend to open up the opportunity for public participation. So in the DRBC, like other regulatory agencies, when they start moving on the application from PennEast, officially moving on it, reviewing it, making a decision about whether to approve or deny it, they will open up the opportunity for public comment, both written comment and verbal comment. And while DRBC originally said that it was going to hold whatever hearings it held on the PennEast pipeline project concurrent with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we, and when I say we, I mean many of you on the phone and a much broader collective of individuals and organizations, convinced the DRBC that that was the wrong decision and that they should hold independent DRBC hearings on the PennEast pipeline project. We have asked them to hold a minimum of 7 hearings, about a hearing every 20 miles of pipe. They haven't told us how many hearings they're going to hold, but they have told us that they are going to hold their own hearings. And so that's something else that has to happen. And of course, again, when this whole process is complete, the DRBC has the ability to approve, deny, or approve with conditions the PennEast pipeline project. Right now, a collaborative of organizations and community groups are working on a letter that we plan to submit to the DRBC on Thursday, where we're going to urge them to do a couple of things. We are urging them in this letter to follow the path of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection agency and to issue a letter, or the Department of Environmental Protection, to issue a letter to the PennEast Pipeline Company to say that they are not going to undertake consideration of the PennEast application submitted to the DRBC because it is simply too deficient, that there are too many data gaps, there's too much misleading information, that DRBC does not have a full and complete and accurate picture of what are the potential impacts of the PennEast pipeline project for water resources, and therefore DRBC, like New Jersey DEP, is going to exercise its authority not to take action on the application that has been submitted so far. We also, in this sign-on letter, are urging the Delaware River Basin Commission to make very clear to the PennEast Pipeline Company that PennEast may not engage in any level of activity, construction activity, when it comes to PennEast until they, in fact, do have DRBC approval, what's called a DRBC docket. So even if they get approvals from all the other agencies and from the states, until they have DRBC's approval, they are not entitled to take any construction action on the PennEast pipeline project. And that's in order to avoid the kinds of problems we've seen on other pipeline projects where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has allowed critical stages of construction to take place before all authorizations have been received by a pipeline project. And it's caused a lot of damage, and it's caused a lot of troubles. So seeing as the DRBC seems to be rightfully taking a slower approach to its review of the PennEast pipeline project, we want to make sure that they're very clear with PennEast, no activity until a DRBC docket has been issued. If you want to sign on to this letter, which is going to be delivered again on Thursday, there you can see a bit.ly link. I'll put it down in the chat box. We'll send it in the follow-up email from this webinar so that you can go and sign on to that letter. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Feridun from Berks Gas Truth.
Thanks, Maya. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm going to assume
yes,
that you
remember
can.
They can't hear you. So, yes.
No, I just thought you might be able to tell me. So I wanted to talk to you about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has come up a couple times on this call already. But a lot has been going on over there, and we're preparing to do a lot more to make the case to FERC and to Congress that they need to be doing a review of this rogue agency. So I'll fill you in a little bit of the things that have been going on so far, pretty much since Trump took office. So one of the first things he did was tell Cheryl LaFleur, who was the former chair of FERC, that she should resume her seat as an interim chair, and that meant that Norman Bay, who was occupying that seat, was being ousted. And rather than take a seat on the commission, he decided to leave altogether. And so when that happened, they knew because of previous departures that the quorum that they had, which was down to the bare minimum of number of people who were remaining to make up the quorum, that was going to be gone. And so they hastily, on Norman Bay's way out, they approved 4 pipelines, like his last week of work. And one of them was the Rover pipeline. I'll come back to that in a minute. But meanwhile, Trump started floating names like Robert Powelson, who's known to us here in Pennsylvania as the former chair of the PUC, who was instrumental in getting the Sunoco Mariner East pipeline approved, and that's actually now Energy Transfer Partners project. Those two companies merged, and we have seen, as if you've been paying attention to papers around the area, we have seen more than 91 spills of drilling fluid just in the construction of that pipeline. So, he's somebody we're not excited to see going to FERC. He's also the guy who said that people fighting pipelines were engaged in jihad recently. So that's how he thinks of us. And then the other fellow who was floated at the time was Neil Chatterjee, who was Mitch McConnell's energy guy. And so he's pro getting out of Paris, pro Keystone XL. So another sad choice to see going up at FERC. And then Kevin McIntyre was also nominated at the time. He is intended to be chair one day, but at the time, those were the 3 names that were floated, and then Trump eventually named Powelson and Chatterjee. So Colette Honorable, in the meantime, one of the remaining 2 commissioners at FERC, left when her term was up in June. So now we're down to 1 commissioner. We've got 2 people nominated, 4 vacancies overall. And so our focus, and when I talk about I'm talking about this group, I'm talking about the 200 plus organizations that have been fighting for congressional hearings for a long time now. We narrowed our focus to the Senate rather than all of the Congress, because it's the Senate that has the approval process. So they're the ones who do a hearing in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and then ultimately if the nominees pass through the committee, then they go to a full Senate vote. And so we've shifted our focus to kind of zoom into the Senate, and we started lobbying, and we started doing a whole lot more. We had already done a great event in Washington in December where we did the people's hearing that some of you participated in. And so, we had lots and lots of documented cases of FERC's abuses that we were handing them, to the congressional staffers and Senate staffers in meetings. So we did no shortage of pushing to get the Senate to, number one, do the hearings that we've been asking for, number two, take advantage of the quorum, the lack of quorum, to use that time well to do these hearings, but also to block the nominees from being approved. And unfortunately, they failed through the Senate Natural Resources Committee when they had their hearing for both Powelson and Chatterjee at the same time. Only 3 senators voted no, Bernie Sanders, Ron Wyden, and Mazie Hirono from Hawaii. And so those are the only ones who voted no. Everybody else on the Democratic side voted yes, and all the Republicans voted yes, so they passed her very easily. So now it was time for them to go for the full Senate approval, and at that point, it really appeared that the Senate Dems were holding up the approval based on wanting parity. The one thing that Trump had not done was nominate a Democrat. So all of a sudden, it started floating the name Richard Glick, who works with the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, is the guy who is going to be their Democratic nominee. I mentioned Kevin McIntyre before. He would be the 4th, and he would ultimately become chair. But those names were being floated for the longest time. And then we get to the last week of August, or pardon me, the first week of August. So the first week of August is when we're talking about the health care bill, if you'll recall, and there was all sorts of stuff going on at the same time. There were some defections going on in the Republican Party who were going to vote against health care. Senator McCain had gotten this terrible diagnosis prior to him returning to Washington to vote on health care. Wasn't even sure he'd be able to be there, how he'd ever be able to come back to vote for his National Defense Authorization Act that was his baby was up in the air. Whether Trump was going to try to fire Jeff Sessions over a recess was up in the air. There was a possibility they wouldn't even go on recess, so that couldn't happen. All sorts of things were in play. And so on Wednesday of that week, the Washington Examiner published an article saying that the FERC vote was not going to happen until after Labor Day, and that's because Lisa Murkowski, who was one of the defectors on health care, was mad at Trump. They were having a war, and she was going to just hold up nominations and everything until after Labor Day. That was Wednesday. On Thursday morning, somebody posted an article from this group, actually. It was somebody had posted it on the PennEast page, an article from Platts. It was breaking news that Trump had made his other nominations official. And with that, the Senate Democrats were happy to see that their Democratic friend had been nominated, and the article said they could vote as early as today. So we took to the phones, everybody, lots of you did. We were just jamming phone lines. We were getting lots of feedback from offices saying that, yeah, we're hearing from you. And around 3:30 in the afternoon, we heard that, don't worry, we're in recess, and it's not going to happen until after Labor Day now. And so rather than take that for granted, we continued to call, started getting different stories every place we talked to. And finally, one office, and that was a New Jersey guy, it was Menendez, was the only office who told us the truth, that they were still in session and they could still vote. And so a little bit after 6 o'clock, I'm watching C-SPAN, there's Lisa Murkowski, and she says that she would like to do away with the procedure on doing the quorum call, which is a procedural thing they can just dispense with. She asked for that. They did it by unanimous consent. And then the next thing up was the vote. And sure enough, it was, I'm pretty sure, unanimous consent of Lisa Murkowski herself and she, because it appears that nobody else was in the chambers at that time. And certainly no Democrats spoke up. So that's where we are. We've got these two guys who have now passed through, they've taken their seats on the commission. So now I'm trying to switch to the next slide. And so it was sort of the best of times and worst of times for FERC. The new commissioners were going to be the perfect rubber stamps, given their backgrounds, given how rapidly pro-fossil fuel they are. So they were going to continue to do what a bad agency was already doing. In addition, Congress was actually recognizing that FERC is their go-to agency if you want to do bad things and want to just be at the beck and call of the industry. And so they started passing bills and laws that actually expand FERC's authority. So one that's very important to pay attention to is 1460, and it hasn't passed yet, and I just heard today it might not even be taken up until next year, but 1460 is a Senate energy bill, and it actually expands FERC's authority in a number of ways, and one of the ways is that it requires other agencies, based on what Maya and Aaron were just talking about, other agencies would have to give deference to FERC. And so that's very important to be guarding against. Right now, if that bill were to come up to a vote, it would have broad Democratic support. And so everybody needs to be calling every one of their senators, and every senator, they can possibly call, everybody from these committees. We need to keep pushing on the Senate to not vote for this terrible, terrible bill. And it does all sorts of other things. It has a renewable energy section. It doesn't even mention solar or wind, for instance. It's a dreadful, dreadful bill. So that's what Congress is up to. The House side actually passed a bill that takes away the presidential border crossing authority that Obama used to stop Keystone XL and gives that to FERC. I mean, it's crazy that they're expanding FERC's authority at the very time that we know that they've been hearing from us. They know what we've been telling them, and still, this is where we are. So at the same time, it's the worst of times for FERC in some ways, because courts have been ruling against FERC in important ways. The Constitution pipeline has been pretty much squashed by the courts, and that has a lot to do with what Maya was just talking about, this lack of information. The New York DEC didn't believe that it had enough information. It rejected the permits, the water permits, and they were sued, and the courts found in favor of New York. So that pipeline has been pretty much squashed. And then the other one that was a really important decision in addition was the Southeast Market Pipelines Project, which is a trio of pipelines proposed as one. And that one actually was thrown out by the approval by FERC was thrown out by the courts on the basis of climate change, that they're not taking climate change into account. So it's very, very important. And so we have, in addition to that, a couple of other things that have been going on, and the big one is Rover. I mentioned the Rover pipeline before. Cantwell and Pallone, it's Maria Cantwell, the senator, who's the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and Frank Pallone, who's the head of the House version of that Energy Committee. They have both called on FERC to investigate Rover. Rover is just like the Mariner East here in Pennsylvania, same company, and it's been having these massive spills. And so they were pressing on FERC to do a bigger investigation than they were aiming to do on that company. At the same time, they started asking FERC some pretty important questions about their own track record, and the way that they're asking them, how many pipelines have you rejected, for instance. So they're starting to look into FERC. It's not the hearings that we want, but they're starting to ask some of the right questions, which is good news, and we have to keep pressing. So what now? So FERC can approve pipelines. They've got their quorum restored. So they've got, the ability to do these approvals outside of meetings. That's what happened in February. They'd had their last meeting in January, but before Norman Bay left, they quickly approved 4 pipelines before he left outside of the public process, and that has already started happening. The Nexus pipeline was approved, and that very controversial Rover pipeline was put back online. They were able to start constructing it again. So that's all happened just in this last week that they've had their quorum reestablished, or a little bit more than a week. The first meeting since January will come up on September 20th, and Neil Chatterjee is now the chair, now that he's been approved, and he's the interim chair before Kevin McIntyre becomes approved. Glick and McIntyre will likely be approved, of course, and then the Senate Energy Bill, as I mentioned before, will come to a vote sometime that, as I just mentioned before, it might not be until next year, but it's a dreadful, dreadful bill. So we have to be fighting against the bills, we have to be fighting against FERC, and we have to be fighting against this just overall terrible energy agenda of Trump's. And so we have plans to do that. And that starts on September 20th, right before FERC has its first meeting since January. We're going to be outside at 8:30 a.m. in D.C., outside of their office, having a rally that morning. And then as soon as the rally is over, people will be lining up to go inside to the meeting. People who are interested in staying outside and continuing to chant and make noise and be disruptive outside can do so. There may be some disruptions going on inside, but for the most part, anybody who's interested in being part of that can be. If you're not interested in being part of that, we still would love to have lots of people in there just being observers. I believe that the action inside would involve maybe doing some, sort of noise making as well. And then the people who are interested in going straight up to the Hill can go up and start lobbying. If you're interested in doing that but you're attending the meeting, you can go up afterwards. We're not setting up formal meetings for anybody. We're asking you to set up meetings with the people you want to talk to. And again, now we can expand it out to the full Congress because Senate doesn't really need to be as much of a focus as it had been. But we do want to talk to the senators about the bad energy bill. We do want to talk to all of them about congressional hearings on FERC. And so we have this big series of events all in one day coming up on the 20th. We need lots and lots of people to be there. And so we also are looking for groups to endorse, and that means that you will also help spread the word about what's coming up. And so you see on this last slide here, we have the links, the bit.ly links to both the endorsement of the action and the participation in the action. We have a church set up in D.C. that's very close to FERC where people can stay overnight because 8:30 a.m. is a tough time to get down to D.C. on any weekday or any day really. And so there's a church where people can stay for, I think it's $27 a night. They can provide linens. So we have all of that set up for people. There's cooking there so people can eat right there at the church. It's a way of getting down there pretty inexpensively, or at least being able to stay there for 1 or 2 nights. And so that's one thing to at least make things a little bit easier on you. But it's something to definitely keep in mind because, again, you know, we need to have a great showing. We need to show from each of these fights that we are not just going to roll over now that FERC is back in business. So we're still going to demand the hearings that we've deserved for more than a year now. We've been calling for them. So, you know, we've made a real good case. It's time for them to start listening to us, and we have to defeat that Senate energy bill. So I think with that, I shall turn it over to you again, Maya.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Karen and Aaron. And what's about to go up now also is a slide to remind folks who haven't yet seen it on social media that on September 17th, we are, again, a large collective of community and environmental organizations are organizing a get-together at Bowles Island, a way for us to come together in our opposition to PennEast, to network, to lament if FERC has given its rubber stamp, which we know is coming. That was never a surprise. But as we've identified this evening, we have a lot of other pathways for battle still, a lot of fight left in us, and we always knew that from the get-go. But September 17th is going to be a great opportunity to get together, to take some actions, to renew relationships, to make some new ones, to network with one another in our opposition. With that, I am going to invite people one last time. If you have any questions of our speakers, if there's any issue that hasn't been covered or that you were confused by, write it in the chat box. If there are no questions, that's fantastic. It means we did a great job. But if there are questions, we still did a great job, but maybe there are questions to be answered. So I'll just leave it for a few minutes for folks to put in their questions if there are any. And otherwise, we'll close out tonight's session. Okay, so it doesn't look like Sarah Casper is typing. Okay. Yeah. Oh, all right. Will you be emailing the links we have seen this evening? Yes, we do have a plan to do a follow roundup email to folks who were on the webinar or who signed up for the webinar. We'll include these dates. We'll include these links. We'll also include the link to the webinar on September 7th. Oh, I see that it's there as well. So you can sign on to learn more about the recent litigation that has taken place around FERC, to learn more about the bad energy bills, in greater detail the bad energy bills that we anticipate coming down the pike, and some other things. So we will send the links. We will send the dates. And we have a lovely thank you from Sarah, and and from Janet, and I don't see anybody else typing any questions. So sounds like we don't have any, so we'll just close out tonight's webinar. And I thank everybody for getting on the line and being such an important part of this fight.